Before dawn, the stables held their breath the way frightened things did before a storm, all heat and silence, and the wet, animal scent of fear. Elias Varn stood in the center aisle with a lantern hanging from one hand and a brush in the other, listening to the horses shift in their stalls, and the smaller pen beasts rustle straw with restless claws. The light threw long bars across the packed earth floor and turned the frost at the edges of the doors to pale silver. Outside, the manor bells had not yet rung first call, but no one in the servants' yard was asleep. Not on a morning like this. He ran the brush down the flank of old Brindle, the broad-chested mare trembling beneath her dappled coat. "Easy," he murmured, keeping his voice low, steady, the same way his father once had. "You know me. Nothing's coming through that door." Brindle's ears twitched back toward him. Her panic sweat smelled sharp. 2 stalls down, a pair of ember goats stamped their split hooves and let out thin, smoky bleats, little red sparks popping from their nostrils to die in the cold air. In the far pen, the manor's glassbacks, lizard hounds bred for speed and scent, paced in jagged little circles, scales clicking softly as if they heard something buried far deeper than footsteps. The whole stable had been wrong since midnight. Animals knew before people. Elias had learned that before he learned his letters, before the shouting in the main hall, before his name was spoken there with disgust. Exile. The word still sat in him like a stone too large to swallow. He set the lantern on a post and moved to the ember goats, laying a hand on the nearest bony neck until the beast's shuddering eased. He was 22 years old and owned nothing worth naming beyond 2 work shirts, a whetstone, a patched winter cloak, and the narrow cot in the loft above this stable. By sunset, if Lord Ansel kept his temper and his promise, Elias would not even have that. He would be turned out through the east gate with a travel ration, a waterskin, and the accusation hanging around his neck like a millstone. Beast thief they had called him. Traitor, whispered the kitchen girls when they thought he couldn't hear. Witch blood, one of the guards had muttered, making the ward sign against his chest. That one had hurt more than the rest, because for half a breath Elias had felt the stupid, secret part of himself wonder if it was true. He had no theft to confess. He had no treason to name. What he had was worse in a house built on old pride and newer fear. The animals chose him. Nervous colts gentled under his hand. Sick penfowl ate from his palm when they would peck no one else. Even the half-feral ridgecats in the outer kennels watched him with yellow eyes and did not strike. It had always drawn glances. In better years, that had meant extra work and quiet praise. Now, with Lord Ansel's prized war stag vanished from a locked paddock and tracks ending at the boundary stones, it meant guilt convenient enough to wear his face. A sudden crash split the dimness. One of the glassbacks slammed itself against the pen gate, hissing, throat pouches flaring blue. Elias turned at once, crossing the aisle in 3 long strides. Hey, stop that. He dropped to a crouch outside the bars. The lizard hound inside was young, all ribs and nerves, its transparent scales showing the pulse of light threading under its skin. Not rage, Elias realized. Terror. The beast was staring not at him, but at his left hand braced on the gate. At the center of his palm, beneath skin roughened by rope and winter work, a mark glowed. Elias jerked his hand back so hard the gate rattled. For one stupid second he thought lantern light had struck some hidden oil or moisture. Then the pain arrived, hot and immediate, as if a coal had been pressed under his flesh. He sucked in a breath through clenched teeth. The glow sharpened into lines, crooked, hooked, almost root-like, spreading from his palm up the inside of his wrist in a pulse of dull gold. No. He stumbled backward and hit the opposite stall, setting Brindle to snorting. Heat lanced farther, winding under his skin, not burning him exactly but searching, writing itself into him. The stable changed with it. Every frightened sound grew distinct. Hoof on wood, claw in straw, fast breath, slow breath, heartbeats like muffled drums. He could feel where each animal's fear began, sharp as a burr in the mind, and somehow he knew that none of it was truly meant for the dark or the cold. Something was coming. Then from beyond the stable doors, out in the black hour before dawn, there rose a cry no man or beast should ever have made, deep and ragged and wild enough to turn every creature inside the building dead still. And Elias stared at the burning mark on his hand as the first heavy impact struck the outer yard gate, and the second came closer. The third impact did not hit the stable. It struck somewhere beyond it, out toward the old kingroad, and the sound carried through the frozen dark like an axe driven into wet timber. Elias flinched anyway. Around him, the stable had gone so still it no longer felt like a place meant for animals. It felt like a held breath. The mare nearest his shoulder rolled one eye toward him, white-rimmed and shaking, and the little sour heat of her panic brushed his skin through the burning mark in his palm. He swallowed hard, grabbed the iron lantern from its peg, and eased the stable door open just enough to slip through. Cold slammed into him. The yard lay under a crust of old snow and moon-pale frost, every fence post silvered, every shadow long and uncertain. The manor gate stood crooked on one hinge, swaying with a faint wooden groan. Beyond it, the old kingroad cut through the fields in a black ribbon, half buried by winter drifts and dead grass. Something moved there. Not man, not horse. Low to the ground, too lean, too fluid even in pain. Elias took one step forward and heard a savage snarl rip through the stillness. The shape lurched, then crashed sideways into the ditch by the road. The lantern light caught a flash of pelt like tarnished moonlight, and the wet gleam of teeth too long to belong to any dog. A shadow wolf. The word came to him from childhood tales told to scare boys away from the hills. Carrion hunters, ghost-coated killers, bigger than hounds, cleverer than men gave them credit for, half vanished in darkness even when standing in plain sight. This one was enormous, all rangy muscle and winter ribs beneath a silver-gray coat darkened by blood. One rear leg was clamped in the rusted jaws of an old trap hidden under the roadside snow, and every time it twisted to free itself the metal bit deeper. Elias should have run for the hunters, for the steward, for anyone with a spear. Instead he saw the way the beast fought, not the frenzy of something hunting, but the raw, desperate violence of something cornered and hurting. Fear flooded him again through the mark, not his own this time. Pain too, bright and hot and blinding enough to make his knee buckle. He sucked in a breath and nearly dropped the lantern. The wolf froze. 4 eyes would have been less unnerving than the 2 it turned on him, pale and reflective as ice under stars. Its lips peeled back. Blood threaded from its leg into the snow in black lines. "All right," Elias whispered, though his voice shook. "All right, I'm not coming close." That was a lie at first. He meant to help. He just did not know how without getting his throat torn out. So he stood in the ditch-edge grass, lantern low, and waited. The wolf tested the trap again, then snapped at the chain. Elias winced as the iron teeth ground bone. His own hand flared with answering pain. He hissed and crouched, clutching the burn mark against his chest. Images flickered at the edge of thought, not pictures exactly, but instincts sharpened into meaning. Hunger, cold, the stink of men. A long run through dark pines. Then the trap, the shock, the certainty that anything approaching meant death. Hours might have passed, or one stretched, frozen moment broken into pieces too small to count. Elias fetched water in a bucket and nudged it forward with a pitchfork, then backed away. The wolf ignored it until dawn began to pale the eastern clouds, then dragged itself close enough to lap once, twice, never taking its eyes off him. He spoke to it because silence felt too much like stalking. He spoke nonsense at first, then apologies, then the half-remembered soft chatter his mother used on frightened foals. Every little easing in the creature's posture felt enormous. Every growl that faded before becoming a lunge felt like a gift. By the time the sky had gone from black to iron gray, Elias' boots were soaked through, and his fingers had gone numb around the lantern handle. The wolf trembled with exhaustion, so did he. Slowly, heart hammering, he set the lantern aside and moved closer. The beast's ears flattened. A warning shudder rolled through it. "I know," Elias murmured. "I know. But if I leave you there, you lose the leg. If I do it badly, you take my hand. That seems fair enough between us." One more step, then another. He could smell the wolf now. Blood, wet fur, wild earth, the bitter tang of old fear. The mark in his palm burned so fiercely he thought the skin might split. Without meaning to, he reached out, not toward the trap at first, but toward the narrow space between them where terror and pain hung like a living thing. Something answered. It was not a voice. It was a current. It ran from his ruined palm into the wolf and back again. A savage pulse of hurt and warning and weary endurance. And Elias felt the exact instant the animal understood that he meant mercy and not mastery. The wolf lowered its head. Not submission, permission. Crying out through clenched teeth as the shared pain lanced up his arm, Elias dropped to one knee beside the iron jaws and set his hands on the trap's frozen springs as the old, hidden bond opened wider inside him, and the world seemed to lean in close to listen. The iron shrieked under his grip. Frost bit into Elias' torn palms as he hauled against the trap's frozen spring, every straining heartbeat answered by the pulse running between him and the wolf. Pain did not stay politely in one body. It crossed the new-opened bond like fire carried on a wire. His shoulder throbbed with the beast's crippled leg. Its lungs hitched with his own ragged breath. He tasted old blood, hot and coppery, though he could not tell whose. "Easy," he rasped, though he was speaking as much to himself as to the animal. The wolf did not snap. Its ears stayed pinned, its great ribs shuddering, steam pouring from its muzzle into the white afternoon. Snow had crusted along its dark pelt, and beneath that pelt Elias felt a strength so immense it frightened him more than the trap did. Not because it wanted to kill him, because if it turned that strength loose in panic, nothing here would stop what followed. He braced one boot against the buried chain and dragged harder. The jaws opened by a finger's width. Then two. The wolf gave a low, raw sound, not a growl, but something closer to a groan forced out of pride. Elias leaned everything into the effort. Stable work had hardened him in dull, useful ways. Lifting feed sacks, dragging water barrels through mud, levering wagon wheels back onto axles. No song would ever be sung about those chores, but now every thankless hour returned to him in his shoulders and back. "Now," he hissed. The wolf tore its leg free. The sprung jaws slammed shut on emptiness with a crack like an axe blow. Elias pitched sideways into the snow, half blind with the lash of shared agony that spiked through the bond. The wolf lurched away 3 stumbling strides, then wheeled, favoring its mangled foreleg, eyes burning pale and fixed on him. Before Elias could push himself up, a horn sounded through the trees. One long note, too short. Men. The wolf heard it too. Its head snapped toward the ridge above the clearing, lips peeling back from blood-bright teeth. Through the trees came the brittle clatter of boots on crusted snow, the jingle of tack and men's voices sharpened by cold. "There, saw the crows rise this way. Mind the beast. Guild pays more if it's breathing, but a dead one still counts." Elias' stomach dropped. Hunters and guild catchers. The kind who talked about creatures the way butchers talked about carcasses. He shoved himself upright and looked wildly around the clearing. To the left, the stream cut black under a shelf of ice and vanished beneath low alder roots. To the right, the slope steepened into a tumble of old wind-thrown pines webbed with branches and half-buried trunks. Bad footing, tight angles. A horse would balk there. The wolf tried to put weight on its injured leg and nearly fell. "Listen to me," Elias said, forcing the words through chattering teeth. "If you run open ground, they'll net you." It should have meant nothing, human noise, air and panic. But the bond caught the shape of his intent and carried it cleaner than speech. Not command, warning, urgency. A path sketched in instinct and mud and stable lanes, where frightened animals bolted, where they jammed themselves, where they survived if someone got them pointed right. Voices came nearer. Elias looked at his right hand and swore under his breath. Against the torn skin of his palm, a faint pattern had risen beneath the blood, dark as soot under ice, a hooked crescent ringed by thread-thin lines. A mark. He clenched his fist at once and wiped it against his coat. No time. He scooped up the trap's loose chain and heaved it across the clearing, burying it beneath snow and brush, then kicked at the churned ground around the wolf's blood. Stable boy tricks again. Break the line. Blur the scent. Make the trail look panicked, directionless. He snatched his dropped wool scarf free, wrapped it once around his bleeding hand, and jerked his chin toward the deadfall slope. Go there, not through it, along the spine where the snow's shallow. The wolf stared at him. Up on the ridge, men burst into view between the trees, 3 in quilted leather and gilled gray, one with a crossbow already half raised. Their hound bayed the instant it scented blood. There, down below, the wolf's body gathered, every muscle knotting against pain. Elias stepped out into the open before he could think better of it, throwing up his empty hands as if he were nothing but a fool from the village who had wandered too far from his chores. And behind him the great beast made its choice. The men on the ridge shouted over one another, but the wolf was faster than noise. It wheeled behind Elias in a blur of white breath and gray fur, then vanished downslope with a lurching, pain-ragged grace that somehow still looked wild and proud. Snow sprayed from its paws. The strip of Elias' shirt, knotted around its wound, flashed once between the trees and was gone. Good, he thought, though his heart hammered hard enough to crack bone. Good, run. There's another one, someone yelled. Elias didn't turn to look. He knew what they saw, one half-frozen trapper's son standing alone in the open, cheeks hollow from winter, hands bare, no spear, no kill, too far from the village to be innocent and too still to be unafraid. The crossbowman skidded down the slope first. Where did it go? Elias let his face go blank with shock. What? The beast, idiot. I heard shouting, he said, forcing his teeth to chatter. I came to see. The hound hit his tracks and erupted into frantic barking, circling him, then lunging past toward the deadfall. Elias felt the old terror rise in his throat. If the dog reached blood, if it found the dragged line where the wolf had leapt the drift, then something strange happened. The barking broke off in a high, strangled whine. The hound froze, hackles standing so hard they made a ridge down its spine, and stared not at the wolf's trail but at Elias. For one breath the world narrowed. The air seemed to thicken. Cold needled under Elias' skin and then turned warm, as if another pulse had fallen into step beside his own. The mark on the inside of his wrist, the one that had looked like a crescent scar since he woke in the barrow hollow, burned silver through his numb flesh. A flood of sensation hit him so hard his knees nearly gave out. Hands not his own, dark with ink and soot, pressed to the brow of a horned cat big as a horse. A ring of standing stones in a summer valley he had never seen. Children laughing as scaled hounds bounded through long grass. Men and women in green-gray cloaks with antler hooks and bright cords around their wrists. Not masters but keepers, speaking names over beasts as if names were bridges rather than chains. And under it all, a truth hammered flat and hidden for generations. Beast tamers had not been tyrants from the old cautionary tales. They had been wardens, treaty keepers, the ones who listened when the wild chose to answer. 300 years ago they had been hunted first by kings who feared any bond they could not command, then erased by priests and guild records until only monster stories remained. The rush sharpened. Trust is not obedience. The words rang through him with the force of remembered law. First rule, shelter before command. Second, pain halves trust, shared risk doubles it. Third, A bonded beast may lend sense, memory, or strength, but only what it offers freely. Fourth, never corner what you mean to keep. Fifth, the vision twisted, showing a line of carved stones buried beneath snow and roots, descending into the forest's heart. A sanctuary path, hidden waymarks masked as old boundary markers, leading away from village roads, away from trappers and tithe-men and guild brands. Sanctuary below the Broken Fang Ridge. Water, heat vents, wards that turned iron dogs and false collars aside. Then the bond snapped back into his body like a hook set deep. The hound yelped and backed away from him, tail tucked. One of the hunters swore. "What did you do?" "Nothing," Elias whispered, and this time it was true in the smallest possible sense. But he knew it wasn't enough, because the men on the ridge were only first arrivals. Once word spread that a winter wolf had taken a trap line, and a village nobody's son had stood in its path and lived, others would come. Guild trackers, lords' men, temple readers if the mark showed. If the bond deepened, they would smell it on him like smoke. A life measured by woodpiles and turnip rows vanished before his eyes, not in grief but with the clean, brutal certainty of a snapped branch. He could not go back to the village, not to his cot, not to the lane behind the tannery, not even to say goodbye. One of the hunters grabbed his shoulder. Elias flinched, and somewhere far off in the trees a growl rolled low and murderous through the snow-laden pines. Every head jerked toward the sound. Elias did too, but in that instant he felt more than heard the answer beneath it. The wolf waiting, wounded and furious, not gone at all, holding to the shallow spine of snow just as he had been told, and beyond it, faint as a heartbeat under stone, the buried path opening in his mind. Elias tore free of the hunter's hand before the man could tighten his grip. Shouts snapped behind him, sharp with warning and outrage, but he was already plunging off the packed trail and into the deeper snow between the pines. Branches clawed at his face. Ice slid into his boots. Twice he nearly went down, catching himself on trunks slick with frost, breathing in ragged bursts that burned all the way to his chest. Behind him came men crashing after him for a dozen strides, maybe 20, and then the forest changed its mind. That low growl rose again. It did not sound far now. It sounded level with the earth itself, rolling under the roots and into bone. The hunters faltered. Elias heard it in the stuttering break of their pursuit, in the curse someone spat, in the sudden crack of a spear haft striking bark as a hand lost its nerve. No one called his name after that. No one wanted to draw the beast closer. Elias ran until the noise of the village men disappeared and only the old winter woods remained. The hush of falling powder, the whisper of frozen needles, the hard hammering of his pulse. Then he stopped with one hand braced against a leaning pine and forced himself to listen. At first, there was nothing. Then a shape moved between the trunks ahead. The wolf stepped into view with a limp so slight Elias would have missed it if he had not been looking for weakness. Blood had dried black along one shoulder where the spear had grazed it. The animal's coat, pale as storm light over snow, was matted in places and lifted in others, every muscle held taut, its yellow eyes fixed on him, not kind, not tame, but measuring. The mark on Elias' palm went hot enough to sting. "I came," Elias whispered, because silence felt more dangerous than speech. The wolf stared one heartbeat longer, then turned. It did not look back to see whether he followed. It assumed he would. So Elias did. The path was no path at all to his human eyes, only a winding series of impossible openings through drifts and black stone outcrops. But when he let the pain in his palm guide him, the route steadied. The buried feeling beneath the earth grew stronger, less like a thought and more like a pull. Once they crossed a narrow ravine crusted over with old ice, and Elias almost lost his footing. The wolf paused at the far side, tail rigid, until he scrambled after it. Once they passed carved standing stones so weather-eaten they looked grown rather than made. each one furred with pale lichen and half swallowed by snow. By the time the trees thinned, dusk had sunk violet into the world. The sanctuary waited in a hollow between ridges, hidden from the village and the road and any honest map. Elias stopped at its edge with his breath caught in his throat. Ruined walls rose from the drifts in broken arcs of dark stone. Pillars leaned like snapped ribs. What had once been a gate lay shattered, but its threshold remained. A single slab of black rock unmarred by frost, etched with lines that glimmered faintly under the snow. Beyond it crouched a long-buried hall open to the sky, and at its heart stood a basin or altar wrapped in the roots of dead trees. The wolf moved to the threshold and lowered itself onto its haunches with a rumble that might have been pain. Waiting, for me, Elias realized. He stepped onto the black stone. The mark in his palm flared. Heat shot up his arm, through his shoulder into his teeth. The lines beneath his boots awakened one after another in a ring of dim amber fire, not flame but something living beneath the stone, something that had slept so long the waking felt stiff and resentful. Snow hissed into steam. From under the altar came a deep internal click, then another, like joints unlocking after an age. Elias stumbled back as the basin split down the middle. Not broken, opening. From within rose a spindle of bone-white material veined in gold, slick as if freshly birthed from the earth. It unfolded with patient precision, petals or fingers or blades easing apart until a hollow at its center faced him. Warmth rolled out from it, carrying a scent unlike the forest, clean rain, animal musk, and the metallic tang of old blood remembered in stone. The wolf stood and pressed its bleeding shoulder against Elias' side. Not attacking, leaning. The contact struck him harder than the sight of the thing itself. He felt the tremor in the great body, the effort it took the beast to remain upright, the wild trust offered not freely, but because there was no one else left to offer it to. Elias lifted his shaking hand and touched the thick fur at its neck. The growl that answered was low and rough, but it did not drive him away. Then the hollow inside the white mechanism filled with light, not fire, not lantern glow, an eye. It opened on him. All around the ruined sanctuary, beneath the snow and stone and roots, answering pulses stirred like nerves reconnecting in a dead limb. And from somewhere far deeper than the village cellars or the guild vaults or any place men still claimed to rule, something ancient turned its attention back toward the mark on Elias' hand and began, at last, to remember him.